Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rima Ghanem, and I will be your moderator. Today's session is a special one. For those who are familiar with Lucidea's webinars, you might know that every once in a while, we host an Ask Me Anything episode in which we ask our audience to submit questions around a certain topic, and we partner with experts in the field to answer them. And today's Ask Me Anything session comes after a series of 6 webinars concentrating on museum digital projects. The recordings for these webinars are all available on our website if you'd like to watch them. Now, before we start, I would like to introduce our company and our guest speaker. About Lucidea. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. We work with GLAM and more broadly information professionals like you to provide solutions and bring visibility and access to collections. We also work closely with experts in the field to offer educational resources such as this one that are free and available for all. We are joined by our talented guest and specialist, Rachael Cristine Woody, who has compiled your questions and will address all your concerns. You might know Rachael from the regular webinars she holds with Lucidea and the blogs she authors for our Think Clearly blog. She is the founder of her own consulting company, Rachael Cristine Consulting. Rachael specializes in museum collections management systems, digital project management, and digital usership, all of which are at the core of our theme today. By providing services to museums, libraries, and archives, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection data into CMSs. Rachael, thank you for being with us today. Your practical experience in digital projects is of essence here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all about it.
Thank you so much, Rima. I appreciate the warm introduction, and thank you to Lucidea for hosting us today. And thank you for sending in such thoughtful questions for us to answer in today's Ask Me Anything session. So let's go ahead and dive in. We have the questions compiled into 3 discrete sections. The first of which is how to set up a museum digital project. The second, how to choose the right equipment, software, and other tools for your digital project to be successful. And then third, we'll cover strategies for how to structure and manage your museum digital projects to be sustainable and successful. So getting into our first section, how to set up a museum digital project. Our first question is, what digital project areas are overlooked or forgotten and likely to cause trouble later on? Which I love these types of questions because it does tend to unearth areas that are overlooked and can sometimes seem like small areas, therefore easy to forget, but yet so critical for your project. And if they're not addressed early on, they will pop up later for you to address. And doing so retroactively is never as easy as doing it proactively. So with that in mind, my answer for digital projects for areas that are most overlooked are file naming conventions, which is the file names that we assign to any of the digital files we create. So you take a picture of an object, that is a digital file, you'll need to name it. Or if you're scanning a document, that is a digital file you've created with the scanner, and you'll need to name that file. We do have additional blog posts all about file naming conventions that you can check out in our additional reading section at the end of this presentation. But that's the number 1, file naming conventions. Number 2 is the file organization structure. And so no matter where you're storing your digital files, whether it's an external hard drive, local to the computer, or somewhere in the cloud, having a folder structure established for how you are scanning or taking images, where you're storing them, if there's a hierarchy, what those folders are labeled, all of that should be thought out proactively so that you can be consistent in where you're storing your files, and it's intuitive for people to know where they need to find the files, what folder to look in. And then the final piece is file storage. So it's often easy for us to think about let's digitize and create these digital files, as well as how we're going to put them online. But the important piece in the middle there is where we're storing these digital files. So whether that is with your collections management system or in a different location, knowing in advance where those files should be living, whether short or longer term, should be determined ahead of time. Otherwise, you will come to that decision in the middle of your project and need to pause and figure it out then. So those are my top 3 areas that are often overlooked that hopefully now you can pay a little extra attention to and not get caught by surprise later on. Second question, do I need a digital specialist before I can begin? So this is a it depends kind of question. Typically, and overall, when we're thinking about digital tools used in a museum or archive setting, most of them are fairly user-friendly at this point. So if you're taking an image with a camera, even a camera phone, since they're getting so good nowadays, or using a scanner, they are getting easier to use. And there's also a lot of free educational resources out there to help you troubleshoot or learn how to use new technology, whether that is equipment or software. So with those two in mind, I think we're getting to a place where we often don't need to have a digital specialist on staff. However, if there's an unusual technique that you want to use, or perhaps a more advanced technique, something like photogrammetry, where the equipment itself can be fairly easy to operate, but the actual methodology is more advanced, there can be, in those circumstances, reasons why you would want to bring on a digital specialist trained in that particular type of methodology or equipment so that it can be done correctly the first time and you don't have to learn a whole new methodology, etc., before you launch your project. Our next question, do I need a CMS before I start digitizing? And for us, CMS is Collections Management System. And the short answer is no, we don't need to have a collections management system in place to start the digitization process. However, there's the considerations that we had mentioned before, like where are the digital files going to live? And then I also encourage you to think about what is the ultimate goal for that digitization. For example, if it's digitization as a preservation method, like a document that is so fragile that if you don't take an image of it, it may be disintegrated and not able to be used or read in a near future term. That is one thing, that's the end goal, is preservation. However, for most of us, when we're digitizing, it's usually to have it in a collections management system for easier management, but also to make it available online. And so while you can digitize without a CMS, if your ultimate goal is for better collections management and being able to publish items online, then you are going to need the CMS as one of your tools. Next question, do I need digital surrogates for objects before it's worth buying a collections management system? So sort of a reverse of the question we just answered. And so a similar short answer of no. The primary job of the CMS is to help with the collections management, whether that is capturing the data or facilitating some sort of care and access. And it's only been fairly recently, speaking in terms of decades as a historian, it's been fairly recently that CMS have started to incorporate attaching visualizations or digital files of our objects to be able to display with the data records and online. And so with the primary job of the CMS in mind, you don't necessarily need to have the digital surrogates, but it is certainly becoming a user expectation, and it does facilitate better care and use of the collections. So there is, I think, a natural pairing and improvement when you have both together, but you certainly don't need it to start out with using your CMS. Next question, if I'm just starting out, what elements should I include in my digital project work? So I love that you're thinking proactively here. For these types of projects, I usually offer this set of prompts to consider. The first one being establishing standards. So this applies to both digitization standards in terms of image quality of capture and file formats used, but it does also refer to metadata standards. So if you have a digital project where part of it is data entry for the object in the CMS, following museum standards, whether that is from the National Park Service Museum Handbook or more localized standards for your museum, having standards and being consistent about them is key. Next up is know what your priorities are. So thinking about end goal here and having that inform priorities and decision making can be very helpful. For example, having a specific end goal of we would like things online will help you make decisions in terms of where operating equipment budget line goes, where staff focus is, what the initial deliverables may be. Those sorts of determinations are all predicated on what your established priorities are. So having those set ahead of time will make the decisions further down the line much easier to make. And then, of course, scoping the projects to be achievable and not overwhelming. For museums and archive settings especially, it's, the job is never done. And it's not because we're not able to, it's just because the collections naturally grow and evolve over time. So our work will always be there. And so knowing that we will never actually be able to finish everything means we need to set different sort of scope parameters so that we are not overwhelmed. This can also increase as your project and achievements proceed. You can, of course, increase your scope as you go along or choose a different scope of project once you've completed this initial one. So just know that you do have options for follow-up work. And with that in mind, try and keep the scope of your work to like a 1 to 2 year time frame so that you don't get burnt out. Along those lines, make decisions that are sustainable. So as we start going through digital projects, when we're considering standards, when we're considering scope, also make sure that you have in mind the capacity for your position as well as any of your team, the tools you have, the resources available, and make those decisions accordingly so that you're set up for success and you can maintain the pace of your work for that particular project. And then, of course, if you digitize, know where the digital files are going to live. So as touched on for a couple of our other questions, it's one thing to digitize and one thing to put it in the collections management system, but have that be a dedicated decision in terms of, does it just live in the CMS? Do you need those files to live elsewhere, whether as an interim or permanently? That should also be considered as part of your project. Next question, do I need to create policies before I start digital project work? So you don't necessarily need to have policies in place before you start your work, because often policy work within museums can take months to a year, depending on how many different stakeholders have a say or participate in the process. So I don't want you to get hung up on trying to get policies created and also approved before you do any digital project work, because you may be waiting a little while. However, as you're doing your digital project work, you should, if you don't already have policies, begin that creation and development process, because the sooner you do have some sort of standards, an established workflow, those types of elements documented, the more consistent you and your team can be across digital projects, and therefore the higher quality of output the digital projects will have. So policies certainly help to establish a high quality project and maintain it. And when you're thinking about policies, specifically, I'm thinking policies around digitization standards. So the quality of the image taken, as well as the file format. We're thinking about catalog standards in terms of metadata, what sort of metadata, either the national standard you're using or more local practice, either way, having that documented. Having a discussion of also policy-wise what goes online. For many museums and archives, it may not make sense for a variety of reasons to put parts of the collection online. And those reasons are usually surrounding legal, ethical, or rights issues, very important issues that you should certainly have a policy around. Related, a takedown policy. We have the best of intentions, of course, as museum professionals when we offer collections information and images online. However, for a variety of reasons, there may be a reason to take down those images or information. And so having a takedown policy in place as to when a museum considers a takedown request or not, having that predetermined ahead of time will save you a lot of angst and headaches later on. And then that rights and use statements. So having those established ahead of time, having those incorporated into a piece of your metadata, having those policies include those types of statements will be very helpful to protect the museum collections and any of the rights associated with that, as well as establishing what is appropriate use. Next question. I'm new to the field and work in a museum that has inconsistently digitized things in the past, which is very common, like you are not alone in this. I want to establish some standards to follow. What standards or best practices already exist that I can incorporate? So consider the following elements in terms of digitization quality and file format. They can evolve over time, so I don't want to offer you like this is the only standards to follow ever permanently. Our digital work is constantly changing year over year. So instead, I'm going to give you a snapshot of what our current standards are in terms of what we consider the standards for both image quality and file format. This particular one is providing a minimal quality grid in that middle column and then an ideal quality in that right-hand column. And it's essentially a range to provide. So another thing we need to consider when we're doing digital project work is how much storage space these files can take up as we amass them. And so we're really trying to strike a balance of making sure we're doing imaging at a high enough quality where we won't need to go back and either digitize or digitally migrate the material again. But we also want to make sure we're not creating files that are so large that they're prohibitive for us to store, let alone upload into our CMS, for example. So this is the current range that I recommend for my clients with a minimum to ideal quality. Ultimately, you're going to need to decide what's best for you. And then my recommendation is to just keep on top of where the resolution or quality standards may be changing. And perhaps every few years, there's a refresh on your policy. Next question, do I need a DAMS, which is a digital asset management system, or a CMS? Are they the same thing? If not, do I need both? This is an excellent question of which the answer has been evolving over the last few years. Essentially, when we're thinking about the jobs that each does, a DAM's primary job is about asset management. So assets being the digital files you're creating, preserving them, storing them, and managing them. For the CMS, the primary job has been about capturing collection information and then with that data, facilitating the collections care and management, as well as perhaps collections access. So they have it at the core have been two different jobs essentially. However, the DAMs and the CMS platforms have been developing in a way where they're beginning to overlap with a lot of their functionality. So there's increasing crossover between the two. It has yet to come to the point where I've seen one supersede the other or where there's a one size fits all option. So there's not like a perfect answer yet, but that is where I see us heading. And so ultimately for you, if you can only pick one system currently, whether due to budget or staff capacity reasons, do an evaluation of the functionality that you need, and then compare that to some of the DAMs and CMS platforms you're considering. Ultimately, if you can only choose one, choose the one that does check the most boxes for you in terms of the functionality that you need. Sometimes for you at the museum, you may have more DAMs specific core functionality needs. Other times it may be a CMS. So do the math, so to speak, in terms of what your needs are, and just know that the evolution is getting to the point where we are seeing significant overlap between the two. This is, of course, a whole other in-depth topic we could go into. We do have a Lucidea webinar on it, so I've got a link to the specific webinar at the bottom of this slide. So definitely go check that out if you want to learn more specifics and more of the, sort of the pros and cons, so to speak, of DAMs versus CMS. Okay, shifting into the second section, how to choose the right equipment, software, and other tools for your digital project. Our first question here, I don't have a large budget, so what are the must-have tools for digitization? So it does depend on what your goals are. Excuse me. Typically, museums will require a tool to digitally capture the collection item and system to record the item data. So if we're thinking about our goals for data capture and that collection management piece, we will likely need some sort of digitization equipment. So whether that's a camera for 3D object capture, or perhaps a scanner if you have more two-dimensional pieces of your collection, having some sort of equipment that makes sense for your collection and your goals. In thinking about the data capture, the most basic form of data capture can be as simple as a spreadsheet. So if you don't have a collections management system, for example, you can start with an Excel spreadsheet. There are also different homegrown databases. I don't necessarily recommend these unless you have the expertise on staff that can create and manage homegrown databases. And the affordability of collections management systems is getting to the point where I would strongly encourage you to consider a CMS before a homegrown database, but it is still technically an option for you. So just know that there's pros and cons to that. And then, of course, once you do have the digital files, where are you storing those? What is it, a hard drive, cloud storage, or are you putting those into a CMS or DAMs? And so to get into some more specifics, especially around how to determine what type of equipment, perhaps what type of digitization methodology you want to use, as well as how to go through a procurement and selection process for CMS or DAMs, we do have a webinar from Lucidea on how to choose the right tools. So for more details, please go check out that webinar recording. Our next question, we don't have a CMS. Do we need one if we just want to put items online? So for this one, the stated goal is putting items online versus needing some sort of facilitation or capture of data, or the facilitation of collection care and management. So with that in mind, if that is truly the only goal and your other needs are being met in other ways for the collection, then no, you don't really need a CMS to put items online. It certainly helps, but there are a few other ways that you can get creative using existing platforms that are either free to low cost. And so I definitely encourage you to play around with Flickr, permanent.org, Pinterest, and other of those somewhat social but mostly aggregative services and platforms that allow you to upload a variety of different file types, sometimes with limited data attached, and have those be immediately available online. If you have some sort of audio visual material, there's of course YouTube, Vimeo, and a few other similar platforms that you can use. And then depending on your skill set and inclination, you can also use websites, for example, WordPress or similar, that have free to low cost, where you can build pages and build a way to post those items, whether that's gallery format or perhaps a more narrative blog series type format. Next question. My boss wants us to use open source because it's free and I don't even know where to begin. What advice do you have for picking an open source product? So I definitely want to acknowledge that this can be a common refrain or suggestion from museum directors or board, whoever it is that you answer to, because when people hear open source, they think free. And while that can technically be the case, a lot of open source products are typically free. They are not free in any of the other inherent costs in terms of getting it set up, needing to implement the software somewhere, needing a server, needing the skill set to know how to implement the software, let alone configure it. So there are costs to consider with that. So first of all, sort of correcting the premise that if this is predicated on it being free, that is not actually accurate. And then when we are considering open source, it really depends on what your goals are and what your capacity is. So if you are requiring a tool to digitally capture a collection item and having some sort of system to record the data, then having open source, if you have the capacity to implement it, can work, absolutely. There are a few other considerations though, and so I am going to recommend that you check out a webinar that I've hosted on my company's channel, Rachael Cristine Consulting, that is a whole hour on open source, items to consider, resources to check out if you are interested and want to learn more about how to use open source type products. So quite a few resources, strategies, things to consider as you navigate your way through this topic. Next question. We have a CMS that doesn't have a front end. Do you have any recommendations for a not too expensive way to post collection items online? So first of all, as a consultant, I want to share from my observation of working with a lot of different platforms over the years, we are getting to the point where the majority of CMS options out there have a public facing option of if that is something your museum needs, being able to switch on. So we're getting to a point where that is becoming a common offering and somewhat expected in terms of users, whether us as museum professional users as well as the audience we're serving. There are still, though, a couple core products that have been around for a few decades that haven't quite evolved to the point where offering that front end is just a natural extension of the product. And so we do have a lot of museums who are stuck with those sort of older products and having the need of needing to put things online, especially with the recent pandemic that we have all lived through, and understanding that if our collections are online, it is that much harder for us to serve our community and our stakeholders. So for options to consider, using your website. So if your museum already has an existing website, depending on what CMS you have, there can be some ways to make a connection with the CMS. If not, you can still use the website and at least the digital files and the data from the CMS to repurpose and populate areas of the website. If your museum doesn't already have a website or it's not friendly to you using it for collection publishing, then considering that WordPress option. There are some different plugins, again, depending on your capacity and inclination, where you could connect your CMS or at least do some repurposing of that data and files. And then, of course, the Flickr, Pinterest, and permanent.org route, depending on what the full total of your needs are, can also be a great way to easily and somewhat quickly get at least a portion of your collection visible and online. Next question, we have old computers and limited storage. Do you have any budget-friendly recommendations for how/where we can store digital files? So first up, I would recommend checking any sort of existing systems your organization is already using. So at your larger museum, are you already using something like Google Drive, Dropbox, Box for any of your document accumulation and collaboration? Because sometimes that can be an excellent interim before your museum is large enough or before it makes more sense for you to invest in a CMS or DAMS. And then also, and this may be an easier, at least stopgap measure, is considering external hard drives, specifically Seagate and Western Digital as two brands that are very good brands and are often recommended in the museum and archives community. Those external hard drives, I recently purchased, I think it was a 5 terabyte hard drive for less than $100. So they are increasing capacity and decreasing cost quite drastically over the last few years. And you can get a pretty heavy duty external hard drive to hold the bulk of your files at quite a reasonable rate, at least more reasonable than perhaps updating the computers, which will eventually need to happen, or investing in a DAMS. So those are some great stopgaps. When possible, I recommend building into the operating budget an ability to account for needing to replace your technology, both in terms of technology obsolescence, but also they do have a lifespan, whether it's an external hard drive or a computer. And so the more you can build that into an operating budget of getting those assets replaced every 3 to 5 years, for example, the better off you'll be in the long term. So just a tip for you to keep in mind. Next question. Are there grants that help fund purchasing digitization equipment or CMS? Short answer, yes. And in fact, there are several different avenues and options both for the United States and Canada. So I do want to send you over to the Lucidea Grants Directory for more information. You can even refine it based on digital projects, refine it based on United States versus Canada, and easily find some options there. And then we also do have a whole webinar on funding and digital projects that I invite you to check out, because that will definitely give you some more ideas and strategies to consider. Okay, and we are now on our final section here, strategies for how to structure and manage a museum digital project. Our first question, my director is asking how much a digitization project will cost. How do I figure this out? This is an excellent question because it's very important we figure out costs before we start a project, and it can be very helpful also in terms of project planning. So I very much encourage people to do the math both in terms of time duration and cost. So first, I recommend figuring out what the project scope is. So what's the end goal? How many items are to be included? What's the expected output? Is it just making digital files, or is there also some sort of metadata creation or item publishing happening? So figuring out what that scope looks like. Second, I recommend considering what sort of equipment and software you may need. So if you don't already have the tools in place, knowing what the cost will be to acquire those tools, to work with the objects that have been selected, to do the output that you have determined. You will need to do some shopping, which has become easier and easier to do shopping online. If there's specialized equipment, you can of course reach out to different vendors for quotes, as well as peer museums. Peer museums are often very happy to share any sort of cost information or what make and model they're using for different digitization equipment. So use the resources and information you have at hand to help inform that budget. And then I recommend assembling and testing a workflow. So if this is a project type or output or equipment, if any of these pieces are new or different, I highly encourage doing a timed workflow of beginning to end. What are all of the steps? Who is involved? How much time does each step take? Because you're then going to use that to do the math, so to speak, to create your equation to answer the question that your boss asked, which is how much will this project cost? This is also incredibly necessary if you're applying for any sort of grant funding to do this work. And I highly encourage you to go check out the Digitization Cost Calculator created by, I believe it's the Digital Libraries Federation, DLF. They have a great cost calculator where you can input the different roles of people involved, their hourly rates, the equipment you're using, the quantity of X items or whatever that you're scanning, and it will give you quite a bit of good information and quite literally do that math for you. So go check that out. And also we have a whole webinar on how much will this digital project cost me. It does include examples of equipment and software costs as well as workflows. So if you're interested in more strategies and details on that, please go check out that webinar. Next question, is it cheaper to send things out to be digitized versus buying equipment? So it can be. There are a few scenarios where it is more obvious where having that outside vendor will be of the most benefit. So I recommend considering for one-off projects where the materials require either specialized equipment, handling, or expertise, using a digitization vendor who already has those tools, expertise, etc., can be much quicker and usually much cheaper in the long run. Another thing to consider is whether the museum has the space, the staff, what have you, to actually perform that work. Sometimes there could already be the space taken up with a different project, or maybe you don't have space at all for a digitization lab, so to speak. So having a vendor in that case also makes sense. And then of course, third, if the museum staff are already at capacity, they don't have any time or ability to take on another project. And so in that case, instead of cutting one of their other projects or delaying the current digital project proposed. Using a vendor in this case can also be very helpful, assuming that you do have the budget for it. Next question. I don't have the time to digitize, catalog, etc. myself. Is it okay to have an intern or volunteer do it? So yes, but with good training, instructions, and supervision. So you need all three of those elements before myself or anybody else I think would feel comfortable having an intern or volunteer do this type of work. Plus, you want to set them up for success, right? So when you are working with non-staff on a digital project, the two most common activities will typically be digitization and or basic data capture and creation to pair with those digital files. So with that, we do have a whole webinar on instruction creation, making sure that your instructions are using a couple different methodologies for the visual, aural, or the doer type learning types. So accounting for different learners and making it as easy and as supportive as possible so that any volunteer and intern could come in, take the training or view the instructions and be able to execute the project successfully and in a way that meets all of your requirements. Next question. The board, researchers, visitors, etc. keep asking us why our entire collection isn't online. How can we politely tell them how much work and money it takes? So this one is amusing in commiseration in terms of this is unfortunately a very common misunderstanding from people who mean well, who obviously care about the museum and the collections, but don't have any sort of information to help them understand how much work and how much money that actually takes for putting any collection items online, let alone the entire collection online. So my recommendations are to start by acknowledging that this is a common assumption, knowing that this is coming from a good place. We don't want to shame or embarrass them, of course, as our stakeholders. And also commiserate that it is an easy misconception to make because for the rest of us in our own lives, it's so easy to snap a photo, post it on a social media platform like Instagram and done, right? So easy. Picture online, data, done. That is, of course, not the extent of what it is that we do as museum professionals. So next recommendation is to briefly outline for them when this comes up how you need to perform the actual action. So when we're doing this type of work as museum professionals, it's not just taking a picture and posting to Instagram, it's doing research on the collection item. It's making sure we're doing a high quality image capture. It's about following metadata standards and making sure that the data entry is happening according to those standards. So having some gentle education available to help illustrate that there's more steps involved and that there's standards to follow. And then finally, having a few examples to provide numbers, some quantitative to help them grasp the enormity of what this job is. And for example, having a project where it's like, okay, when we just did X project, it was about imaging and cataloging 500 objects from the collection. It took however many hundreds of hours probably to do that type of work. And the cost was between equipment and staff time this much, which is usually thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the scope of the project. So having those different elements in terms of like, yes, this is a common assumption, here's how it's not correct, and here's what it actually takes will help spread your message, or at least give them some hopefully more convincing educational information to support you with versus asking you why not everything is already online. Next question. Our small team is already overworked. Do you have strategies for how to make the best use of staff time? Absolutely. Finding hacks or ways to make our time more efficient is always something of value. My immediate recommendations would be to have a documented workflow in place to help staff keep pace and keep focus. So if we know that we have a certain amount of steps and even like a visual reminder of those steps, that helps us keep pace and helps us stop from being distracted or even thinking about, oh, okay, well, what was next? Second, perform repeat tasks in batches in order to decrease transition times. So especially for digitization projects where it's go get the object, do the imaging, put the object back maybe, do the research, etc. Perhaps we get a bunch of objects out and ready to image, and then we batch image all of them, and then we put all of those objects away. So we are saving time that ultimately, especially as you add up the hundreds of items you might be doing this work for, you're saving minutes with each of those tasks by doing them in batches. And then, of course, whenever there is downtime or wait time, particularly when we're waiting for imaging to happen, perhaps file uploading, etc., there can be other work done intermittently. So my most common example I use is if you're digitizing something like a document at a high resolution, that could take several minutes. And so while that is happening, capturing some basic data in a spreadsheet ready to go is a great way to economize on that time and help progress the project that much further by capitalizing on some downtime. Next question. We have items cataloged in a CMS, but we have hardly any digital surrogates. What recommendations do you have for choosing where to begin? So I would say consider these prompts. What are the items that are the most requested, the most popular, the most important, quote unquote, etc. I would then also have you consider what items can help tell a more inclusive story. Sometimes when museums focus on the greatest hits, so to speak, it's easy to miss out on other depths of our collection that could help provide a counter story or additional context. So making sure that there is a filling in of the gap, so to speak, should be a priority. And then what items will be highlighted in the near future? So thinking of projects coming up, how can that help inform your current or future work, knowing that you're going to need to help support those projects as they come down? So for example, if you know a particular photography exhibit is happening in 2024, perhaps your 2023 priority should be supporting and getting ready for that project and digitizing adjacent collections that can help support the exhibit. All right, so those were the end of the questions, which were excellent ones. Thank you so much again. I have some resources to leave you with. First is the announcement that we have a new book coming out. It's Museum Digital Projects in You, Where to Begin. So offering a lot of these strategies with additional detail and resources in a book format, and it's available courtesy of Lucidea Press. So I encourage you to go get your copy at the link provided. And please do let me know how you like it. We are just releasing this book, so I'm really excited for you to get it into your hands and to have you use it. We do have additional reading, of course, many blog posts via the Lucidea Think Clearly blog. So if there was any section of this webinar where you're wanting to learn more or to reference different strategies or resources, I have these posts for you to go check out. Everything on digital project creation, a few on CMS and DAMs to help inform your work, as well as core areas. And then of course, workflow, how much will it cost? What are the secrets for success for a digital project? All of that. So please go check out those posts if you would like to learn more. And then Lucidea resources, there's a whole webinar suite where you can go check out the webinars that we've recorded and shown previously. Several of which we mentioned throughout this presentation. So just know that there is a whole suite you can go and check out for all of your webinar needs. We also mentioned the Lucidea Grants Directory. As we spoke about briefly, digital projects, digitization, acquiring and using a CMS, there is grant funding available for these types of projects. I encourage you to go check out the directory. And then if you are new or need additional support around grant writing, Lucidea and I partnered a couple years ago and created a grants workbook and templates, one of which is about digital projects and another which is about acquiring and using a CMS. So go get those templates and use them if you need help around that. And then I mentioned a few webinars that I had done through Rachael Cristine Consulting, so please feel free to check those out. The YouTube channel is Rachael Cristine Consulting, and they're all free and publicly available. And with that, I will turn it back over to Rima, and thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Rachel, for answering all these questions so minutely. I like that there was a variety of questions covering the different stages or phases of a digital project. This gives us a comprehensive idea on what a digital project could entail in case we decide to embark on such a project. We're also super excited about the new book coming out soon. So to our audience, if you have more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are on the screen. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. On behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending, and until next time.